Everybody, this is November 21st, 2021. This is the morning preaching time. Let's begin in prayer as we usually do. And Dale, would you lead us in prayer this morning, please?
Beloved Father, we know that you are in control of all things. What Stephen said here today, what is here.
Good morning, everyone. Make enough noise there. Turn to Matthew chapter 24, if you would. Message today is the same as every other message, but then, like every other message, different. And so let me read and give you kind of the introduction or context. In Matthew 24, the disciples in verse 3, Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives. The disciples came unto him privately, saying, "Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world?" Now, when he says, when they're asking the question, when shall these things be, if you look up, in verse 1 and 2, Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. So when they're asking in verse 3, when shall these things be? Part of the question has to do is, when is this temple going to be destroyed that you're talking about? When this temple, because the temple is an amazing structure. It took forever to build, and I know in Europe I've seen these temples, these churches that literally they spent 600 years building, and they're amazing to see. And that was the kind of building that this was, the kind of structure this was. So they couldn't imagine this thing coming down. And so they ask him, when shall these things be, the destruction of the temple, and what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? So with that in mind, jump down to verse 23. Jesus says, Then if any man shall say unto you, Lo, here is Christ, or there, believe it not, for there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible they shall deceive the very elect. Behold, I've told you before. Wherefore, if they shall say unto you, Behold, he's in the desert, go not forth. Behold, he's in the secret chambers, believe it not. For as the lightning comes out of the east and shines even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For wheresoever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together. Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn. And they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Now learn the parable of the fig tree. When his branch is yet tender, he puts forth his leaves. You know that summer's nigh. So likewise, when you shall see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. But of that day and hour knows no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as the days of Noah were, so also shall the coming of the Son of Man be. I'll stop there and have some words of comfort for believers. This is it's a difficult passage in the sense that over the years many commentators and preachers have had difficulty separating out which one is he talking about? The destruction of the temple? Is he talking about the sign of his coming? Is he talking about the end of the world? Which is which? And there's some areas where that's not exactly clear. But I want to point out something today that I think is clear, and I think it is important. Number one, here's a great comfort to believers, that in the end, you won't have to seek Christ. He's coming for you. He's coming for you. Look at this. This is amazing. Where he says in verse 26 of Matthew 24, if they say to you, go in the desert, he's out there, he's in this secret place, you want to find Jesus, he's over there, he's over here. No, not at all. He says in verse 31, he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. You don't need to go looking anywhere. He's coming for his people. And I think that's a comfort, because I think when people think of these last days and all the panic and all the nervousness, should Christ return, and if he should return in your lifetime, not to worry. If you're his, he'll find you. Just like the angels that went and got Lot out of Sodom. They'll drag you out if they have to, but you will not be left. You will not be left. Point two, don't be swayed by miracles, all this razzmatazz of religion. Jesus says in verse 24, there shall arise false Christs, false prophets. They shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that, if it were possible, they would deceive the very elect. But they won't. But don't be deceived by great signs. And then what's the point? The point is it's the message that separates. It's the message. And do they speak of this Christ? Do they speak of his work on Calvary? Do they speak of his blood as being altogether satisfactory to the Father for the sins of his people? If they speak not those truths, it doesn't matter what they do. Whether they heal people, or I don't care if they raise from the dead, supposedly. It doesn't make any difference. Just like the Egyptian, those magicians from, and I was always amazed at what the magicians in Egypt were able to pull off. It's absolutely fascinating. How could they make things appear like what they did? It doesn't matter. What's their message? What's their message? Making a snake out of a stick, that's a pretty good act. The third point I would make is there's going to be a suddenness to his return. And that is, it says, for his lightning comes out of the east and shines even unto the west. That's a pretty momentous event, right? I've been in my house at night, or actually I remember one time I was at a gas station and there was a lightning bolt that must have hit the top of the station. And I'll tell you what, when lightning strikes like that, it gets your attention. It gets your attention. You don't sleep through that. You stand bolt right up. So that's the way it's going to be. And here's the verse that really the Lord just captured my attention this week. And in verse 28. For wheresoever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together. Now that is a verse that's very, I don't know, all my life I don't think I've understood that one bit. But the Lord just gave me the direction on that this week. And so I asked myself the question, who are the eagles, or what are the eagles, and what's the corpse? What is he talking about here? Well, number one, the eagles represent both the protection of God and the vengeance. And we know that it's the protection of God, certainly, in so many different places. Exodus 19:4, and many other places. That was one verse, and I think I have that posted up there for you, where it says, "You have seen what I did unto the Egyptians, said the Lord, and how I bare you on eagle's wings and brought you unto myself." And we know that the eagles we take residence underneath the wings of the eagle, and as a type of Christ, as a protection for believers. And we see it also in Deuteronomy 32:11. I put that there for you. As an eagle stirs up her nest, flutters over her young, spreads abroad her wings, and takes them and bears them on her wings. That's the way God is with his people. He just comforts and protects them. And so we see that the eagles are definitely a picture of God's protection over his people. But they're also, in Job 39:3, speaking of the eagles, Scripture says, her young ones, that's the young ones of eagles, also suck up the blood, and where the slain are, there is she. An eagle, somewhat like a vulture, will eat both living and dead things. An eagle doesn't only eat living things, it'll eat dead things as well, and like a vulture, it knows them from far, far away. In Habakkuk, it says that these eagles, in terms of destruction, it'll fly as an eagle that hastes to eat. That there's in describing destruction, it comes quickly like an eagle. And so the best. So that's just the eagle. I wanted to put that to the side. And then what is the corpse? That where it says the carcass or corpse, it's the Greek word is literally fallen, or one that's and throughout Scripture is used as that of a corpse or a dead, something that's dead. So why would it be that wherever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together? And I just and the Lord just opened a verse to me that made it all make sense. Turn to 1 Peter 4:17. Oh, actually, I've got it there laid out for you. It says, and we saw this actually in Bible study time in the Old Testament as well. But in 1 Peter 4:17 it says, "For the time has come that judgment must begin at the house of God. And if it first begin at us, what shall the end be of them that obey not the gospel of God?" And what you're seeing, I assert to you, what you're seeing here is this is the judgment of God on the dead church. In the end, the judgment that's coming is going to begin at the church of God. And as you see, at the end time, at the end of the end, the church is dead. The church is dead. Now, here's the good news. The church is dead, but the good news is when he returns, he's still sending out his angels to pick up the elect. So, in broadly, it's very much like Sodom and Gomorrah. In Sodom and Gomorrah, God came and he destroyed that city entirely, but he still pulled out his people. He still pulled out his people. And so in the end, in terms of the church, Jesus asked the rhetorical question in Luke 18:8. He says, well, turn to Luke 18 if you would. He's in Luke 18. He was talking about the unjust judge and didn't fear God. Verse 2 and 3, the widow comes and makes a complaint against her adversary. The unjust judge she keeps complaining and complaining, and finally says, well, I'm going to do something about this. And verse 7, shall not God avenge his own elect, which cry night and day unto him, though he bear long with them? I tell you that he will avenge them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, shall he find faith on the earth? What he's going to find is a dead church. He's going to find a dead church, but notwithstanding that dead church, like I say, the good news is, even though the church is broadly speaking dead, just like Sodom and Gomorrah, gone, and yet there were people that had to be picked up. There were people that had to be picked up. Those elect. That's why he sends his angels with the great sound of a trumpet, and their job is to gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other, and he will. And he will. And so I didn't see many people that, I saw, in terms of studying for this, I saw different commentators and some who I've respected in time past. They just had no idea what the corpse was. It might be this, it might be that, it might even be Jesus, which makes no sense at all. But if you wanted to interpret this verse, it's where the corrupt body of sin lies, there will be the eagles of vengeance gathered together. I saw that one commentary. That's not exactly what I'm saying, but I think in the gist of it's the same, that when God comes, judgment will begin at the church. And that's where the eagles will be gathered together, and the judgment of God is coming. So the third point I would say to you, just in terms of back to Matthew, is that there are those who think that this is altogether talking about the destruction of the temple. Remember I said at the beginning, which one was he talking about? The temple, or his coming back, or the end of time? And they would say that where he says, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. And I've lost where that verse is, but and so they would say, well, this is talking specifically about that generation at that time, and that's when the temple was going to be destroyed. But they would have to answer to verse 27, where lightning's coming from the east to the west. They would have to answer to verse 30, where it says the Son of Man is going to appear in the clouds of heaven, coming down with power and great glory. They would have to also answer to the angels gathering up the people from the four winds. And so I don't think that can fly. That all happened when the temple was destroyed, and as we know, it didn't. So just to make a clarification, there are those who, I don't know how they would interpret these things if they say that all happened back then, because it obviously didn't. The fourth point I would say about this passage is that it's saying the gospel is going to come to an end. The gospel preaching is going to come to an end. And in verse 29, he says, immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light. The stars will fall from heaven, the powers of heaven shaken. Now that's either physically, but I think it's speaking of the sun being a picture of Christ, the moon being the picture of the church. That there will be no more light. No more light from the Lord to men. That the gospel will cease and desist, and judgment is now upon the earth. The powers of heaven are going to be shaken. So point 5, now it might be literal, but I believe it to be saying there's no more hope. The gospel is not going to be preached at the end of time. It's over. And point 5, Christ will return. In verse 30, then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn. We know from Revelations that they're going to cry, hills and rocks fall on us, hide us from the face of the Lamb. They're going to mourn. They'll see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And that's going to put an end to all the speculating. Is Jesus God or not? Is he omnipotent or not? He's going to come not just in some vague form. It's going to come with power and great glory. He's going to rock this earth. He's going to send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet. I don't know if you ever. It's always amazed me when I go to hear music and how loud those trumpets can be, how loud musical instruments can be, and just overwhelm you. Or if you've ever seen a military display, it's an awesome thing. And he's going to come with a great sound of a trumpet, and there's going to be great power, great glory. He's going to gather together his elect from the four winds, as I'd said. And to me, this is very, very much like Sodom and Gomorrah, where his angels are going to pull the elect out. If you remember, in Sodom and Gomorrah, Sodom was wicked to the core. Lot was vexed by being there every day. It vexed his soul to be in the midst of these people. So much so that he couldn't even have visitors entertained without them, without the community wanting to molest and abuse the men. Just a complete given over to sin. And God pronounced judgment on it and sent his angels to pull Lot and his family out. So Jesus makes an analogy then that I think is worth thinking. I've thought about it in a different way this week, and it just occurred to me more recently. He says, this is a simple thing, Jesus says. This is not, there's nothing tricky here. He says, the parable of the fig tree. Now, I either don't get the parable, or it's a very simple parable, which is good for me because I'm pretty simple thinking. So when the branch of a fig tree is tender, puts forth leaves, summer's nigh. Well, I can get that message. So when you see these things, you know what's coming. It's no mystery here. When you look at the tree and it's starting to bud, it's getting warmer, the winter is past, and something is coming. He said, so likewise, when you see these things, and what are the things he's talking about? He's talking of the word I would use, the fact that the gospel is becoming less and less and less. That's the sign. That's the sign. When you start seeing the fact that the gospel preaching churches are fewer and fewer and fewer, and the people's willingness to even entertain the message of the gospel becomes less and less and less. He goes, when you see these things, know that the end is near. It's not a great mystery. It's not a great mystery. And he says, then he goes on to say, like in the days of Noah. Turn to Genesis chapter 6. Now I know it says in the days of Noah. Later on he's going to say, well, people were marrying and giving in marriage, and it was all just kind of routine. But it wasn't really in the days of Noah. I mean, that part is true. They were just carrying on with life. They were carrying on with life, but they were carrying on with life. If you look back in the days of Noah, it wasn't a good situation. Let's begin in verse 1 of chapter 6. And it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and the daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw their daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. And the Lord said, my spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of men came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men, which were of old, men of renown. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. And the Lord said, I'll destroy man whom I've created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping thing, and the fowls of the air, for it repents me that I've made them. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. These are the generations, etc., etc. Jump down to verse 11. The earth also was corrupt before God. The earth was filled with violence. And God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt. For all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth, and God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I'll destroy them with the earth. Then he goes on to tell them to make the ark and so forth. So as in the days of Noah, what were the days of Noah? Violence, corruption, rebellion of every which kind. And I understand a fair argument can be made. Well, it's always been that way. I do get that. But you combine that with the slow diminishing of the gospel over and over and over, and it gets to be a somewhat dark scene. Officially, the last days began after Jesus rose. These are the end times, as the Scripture says. There's no doubt about that. But I know the end of the end is nearer than it was yesterday, and that is also for certain. But here's the good news. I want to reiterate the good news. Two points of the good news. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. When He returns, whenever that is, if it's in your lifetime, He'll get you. He's coming to get you. And the final point I would make is turn to Genesis 18. There's so many things that, in the Bible that kind of that repeat, themes that repeat over and over again. The idea of a sacrifice is over and over and over in the Scripture. The idea of the innocent for the guilty in a sacrifice is repeated over and over again. And another thing that's repeated over and over again is God's judgment. God's judgment, and in the Lot and the Sodom and Gomorrah story, Abraham is trying to intercede for Lot and for the city. He's saying, well, if there's 50 righteous people in there, you won't destroy it, right? And then if it's, well, how about 40? And how about if there's 20? And so Abram is interceding with God on behalf of Lot and really for the city. And then you come down to verse... let's just start in verse 20 of Genesis 18. And the Lord said, because the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grievous, I will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the cry of it, which has come unto me, and if not, I will know. And the men turned their faces from thence and went toward Sodom. But Abraham stood yet before the Lord. And Abraham drew near and said, wilt thou also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Peradventure there be 50 righteous within the city. Wilt thou also destroy and not spare the place for the 50 righteous that are therein? That be far from thee to do after this manner, to slay the righteous with the wicked, and that the righteous should be as the wicked. That be far from thee. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? I love that verse, that no matter what the situation is, in judging Sodom, God did right. And in judging and in pulling out Lot, He did according to His character. He protected and saved His people, which He always does. So the use of all these things, I like the way Jesus said this with regard to this saying back in Matthew 24. And He said, there's going to be a lot of false Christs, and things are going to arise and all this. He goes, behold, I've told you before. I'm going to tell you before this all happens what you can expect. So that's the use. We've been told. We've been told the dark days are going to come. That false religion and false Jesuses are going to flourish in the last time, and they're going to tell you all kinds of things you ought to do. You'll know them by their message. Are they speaking of a glorified Christ sitting at the right hand of the Father? All things at His feet. This Christ who's purchased pardon for His people by His blood. Not for everyone, because if He purchased it for everyone would be saved, certainly. And they're not. But His blood is totally efficacious, as we say. It means it's going to work. It's going to get the job done. for the people that He's died for. So you'll know these false Christs and these false prophets by their message. They'll also tell you need to go somewhere to do something to find them. In the last days, the church will essentially be a corpse. Not that there won't be believers. This is the good news. That's who the angels are going to be coming from. Just like Lot. Sodom, I don't know the size of Sodom, but I'm assuming is a fairly good-sized city. Dead, spiritually dead. Not Lot, but the city. And judgment is going to begin at the church. That's at the end, we're warned corruption and violence against God, as in the days of Noah. That's the corruption and violence God's speaking of. They corrupt the gospel. They violently take that which is God, the glory for salvation. That's what they're doing. They're robbing God. They're saying salvation is ours, it's not His. That's the violence. That's the corruption. That's the thing that God that despises. It dishonors His Son. It dishonors Him. And in the last days, we've seen that. We see that corruption. We see that violence. And it's going to be all around us, and it is. God's judgment will be swift. The earth shall mourn. They can cry, the rocks and hills fall on us. But the saints will be gathered by His angels. So when all these calamities befall the world and the world mourns, be at peace. Believers are secure in Christ and because of Christ's work alone. And be excited because when He returns, it's going to be with power and great glory. And it'll all be resolved. And I encourage you not to be with those that fear or fear His return, but close with Him. Worship this God. Cease from your own works. Cease from taking that which is God's alone, and glorify this Lord Christ. He's able to save a sinner. He's able to save those in need. He's able to save the orphans, those who have no father. And reconcile and close with Him, I pray. Pastor Chuck, would you close us in a word of prayer?